Hi, and welcome to the Men on the Path to Love podcast, the When Enough is Enough episode. I'm Bill Simpson, your host. I coach men who are struggling in relationship, how to communicate effectively, build trust, and deepen intimacy so that they can be the best version of themselves in relationship and live the life they love. So I received an email response to the My Relationship or My Career episode, where a listener posed a very good question that I thought would lend itself to a full episode. He was asking how to make sense of having to be the one to break up the relationship and see it as a good thing. Yeah, initially having to break up with someone or ask for a divorce doesn't feel good. In fact, it usually feels awful, right? Especially the longer the relationship has been going on. You know, the investment of time and energy, and the risks involved, like the impact on kids, family, friends, your work, and so on. And when you're the one breaking it off, there can be feelings of guilt, shame, remorse, etc. So it's natural not to feel good about ending the relationship, even if it wasn't good for you. Once the deed is done, there can also be a huge sense of relief. You no longer have to deal with the stress of being in that toxic or chaotic relationship, and your anxiety level drops, and you feel better. I think of Keith and Barbara, not their real names. They had been in a committed relationship on and off for about 5 years. A roller coaster of a relationship, to say the least. When they first met, Keith had been through a divorce about 2 years prior, and Barbara was not happy in her marriage. They met around their mutual interest in yoga. Keith had been practicing yoga for several years, and Barbara was relatively a beginner. They attended the same weekly class and were friendly with each other from the start. Eventually, they became friends and started to meet outside of the class. It started with having coffee, and then lunch, and eventually dinner. And they started to share that they had feelings for each other. Even though Barbara was unhappy in her marriage, she expressed to Keith that she was hesitant to act on her feelings because she was still married and didn't want to have an affair. Well, Keith agreed, and they decided to remain friends and continued seeing each other in yoga class. One of the things that Barbara was attracted to was Keith's commitment to yoga and personal growth, as Barbara was on her path as well. So, fast forward a couple of months later, Keith and Barbara went to a yoga retreat for the weekend. They had driven separately and had reserved separate rooms. Well, the first night, Barbara revealed that she and her husband were now legally separated, and that she was now available to take their friendship to a different level. Keith was ecstatic, and they spent the rest of the weekend together. After the yoga retreat, Barbara told Keith that even though she and her husband were legally separated, they had agreed to live in the same house because of their toddler daughter. Well, Keith was disappointed to hear this. Barbara said that she was free to date him, yet Keith was not comfortable with it. After giving it some thought, he decided to go ahead and give it a try. But over time, he just couldn't deal with it. He was feeling like an outsider in the relationship. He ended up giving Barbara an ultimatum. Either she or her husband had to move out if he was going to continue to see her. Well, Barbara refused to leave or to ask her husband to move out. And as hard as it was, Keith stood by his word and told Barbara that he wasn't going to see her anymore. He said that when or if she and her husband get divorced, to call him and see if he's still available. Keith still had feelings for Barbara, and it hurt like hell not to be with her. Yet he felt good about the decision he had made and the boundary he had set. He went so far as to finding another yoga studio so that he wouldn't be tempted in seeing Barbara in class. Well, about 8 months later, Keith gets a call from Barbara. She said that she and her husband filed for divorce. Her husband moved out and that she had the house to herself. Well, Keith couldn't believe it. He still had feelings for her, and they decided to commit to being in relationship. Well, without going into all the details of their 5-year roller coaster ride, basically what happened was once they were together, Keith noticed Barbara was not really interested in yoga and personal growth like Keith thought she was. And they started arguing a lot and eventually agreed to getting couples counseling. Now, Keith was totally committed to his growth and growing the relationship, and he was really hoping for a future with Barbara, so he was eager to begin the work. Unfortunately, Barbara wasn't so eager. Even though she agreed to do the couples therapy, she didn't put a whole lot of effort into it except to put the blame on Keith for everything that was going on. And Keith would take ownership of his part and accepted responsibility. Barbara really struggled in trying to communicate the way the therapist had suggested. As a matter of fact, when Keith tried to talk to her in the new way, she would say something like, don't use that psychobabble crap on me. He would feel so deflated because he was really trying to make it work. So the roller coaster continued where this pattern would happen. They would have a good stretch, maybe a month or so. Then they would have an argument, mostly about the relationship. Keith wanted them to move in together and eventually get married, and Barbara, not so much. And they would spend hours and sometimes days hashing out the same stuff over and over. And when it would get to the point where Keith was about to give up, Barbara would somehow sense it and would change her tone. She would apologize. She would want to do yoga together or suggested going on a couples retreat or something like that, to where Keith would end up changing his mind and decide to stay. And they would do yoga together and go away for a weekend, and things would be really nice. Then the arguments would start up again. And eventually, this got really old for Keith. He had tried everything he could think of to make her happy and to please her, and yet she always had something to criticize or to complain about. It seemed like Barbara was very unhappy in the relationship, yet she was not about to end it. Well, after putting like 110% in trying to make the relationship work and not seeing any real results and seeing Barbara's lack of effort to change, Keith finally said, enough is enough, and he ended the relationship. There was a huge part of him that was relieved to have ended it, yet it felt as if she had broken up with him because he felt heartbroken. He still loved her and wanted to be with her, but for the sake of his mental, emotional, and spiritual health, he had to leave. Ending the relationship cut him deeply, to the point where he questioned whether he would be in another relationship again. Now, after some time had gone by and lots of coaching, self-reflecting, self-compassion, and healing, Keith put himself out there to start dating again. And eventually, he found the love of his life. They got married, opened a yoga studio together, and now he is living the life he loves. So going back to the email about making sense of having to be the one to do the breaking up and feeling good about it, well, Keith didn't feel good about it at first, although he knew he had had enough. Even though it didn't make sense to his heart because he still loved her, it did make sense to what was important to him, his value of being true to himself and being authentic in relationship. Keith said that he had no regrets in being in the relationship with Barbara. In fact, he said that he was grateful and that he wouldn't have changed a thing. The reason being that he learned so much about himself, the part he played in the relationship, and about what he really wanted in his next relationship. He felt that if he hadn't gone through what he did in the relationship with Barbara, that he wouldn't have the fulfilling relationship he is in today. Here's a quote that I think helps make sense of it all. It's from author Joseph Campbell. He says, "We must be willing to let go of the life we've planned so as to have the life that is waiting for us." And on that note, we will wrap up this episode of the Men on the Path to Love podcast, the When Enough is Enough episode. So here's something for you to think about. Are you really clear about what your values are? Do you and your partner or spouse share the same values? I mean, really share the same or similar values? Well, knowing your values and your spouse's or partner's values and acting on them can put you on the path to love and living the life you love. Find out how on the next episode of the Men on the Path to Love podcast, the Values episode. And remember, if you have any questions or issues about your relationship you need help with or comments about the podcast, please email me at bill@pathways2livingwell.com. That's bill@pathways2livingwell.com. And if you know someone you think might benefit from listening to this podcast, please share the link and share the love. And until next time, keep your heart open and stay on the path to love.